Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for making your way through the rain and to this opening of the first UNEA Science Policy Forum. I know that we have a great mix of people in the room, and I'm hoping that during this plenary session, we're going to hear not just from scientists, not just from industry, not just from stakeholders, but also some of our colleagues from the permanent representatives here in Nairobi, but also those who've travelled from afar. We have had some people tell us that they've had travel difficulties, so we're expecting as the morning rolls on that more and more will enter. But I really am very, very pleased to open the session and hand over now to our moderator for the opening plenary, Tom Cummings. You have the bios of all our speakers and key people in the programme, so I won't spend too much time on explaining who people are. But Tom requires just one or two sort of special points. He works continuously across the world and now with the Banking Alliance, trying to bring people to the understanding of sustainable development, but how important it is to have science and evidence at the core of what we do. So in the room, we have decision makers who are going to reach out, and I would just want to really encourage you that despite the architectural difficulties of a UN setting, all people are equal in the room. So some might be sitting slightly higher, but please, all of you feel that you have an equal voice in this room. And we're going to give Tom a roving mic, so he will come and take provocations also from the floor. So please don't feel inhibited by the fact you're sitting in a row with a microphone in front of you. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Tom. And again, thank you so much for all of you coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Wonderful that we can all be here to work on science policy. I will take a cue out of what Jackie said just a moment ago and start by asking you just to turn to the person next to you and introduce yourself. This is a way that we can start to see who's in the room. So take a moment and say hello. Right, okay. Well, it appears we don't need speakers today. This is very good. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Just to set the scene a little bit very quickly. This morning we'll begin with Achim Steiner, Executive Director of UNEP, and then we'll hear again from Jackie McGlade. I think you know who Jackie is. I don't need to introduce her as the Chief Scientist. We'll have a chance then to hear from Sir Peter Gluckman, and he's coming here as Chief Science Advisor from the Prime Minister in New Zealand. Peter, I hope the time zone is not affecting you too badly today, but lovely that you're here, and I think he intends to be provocative, that's if we can set out the stage in that way. We'll also then have a chance after that to just hear from different voices coming from the policy side, from the science side, and from the journalism, the narrative building side. So Judy Wahungu, Cabinet Secretary and Minister of the Environment, is here. We've got Conrad Paulsen Rivas, he's the Ambassador and Permanent Representative from Chile, is able to join us this morning as well. We have Anne Larry-Godry, who's joined us as the Executive Secretary of the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Ashok Khosla, I think, will missing in action. He'll be here any minute. And Ashok, really, he's our former chair from the International Resource Panel, and he's the founder and president of something called Development Alternatives, and brings, I think, this great interface perspective. And then our wingman at the end is Andy Revkin, a science and environmental writer, and again, I hope an agent provocateur in the room to really question and challenge some of the things that he's hearing as well. So I'm looking forward to a lively first introduction of speeches, then short panel presentations, hearing from each of the panelists. Then it'll be over to you. When I bring it over to you, we will have a tremendous amount of time in the next hours and 2 days to put our stall out and share our stories. So I'd like this not so much to be when I call on you to share your story, I would like you to share what you don't know, your questions. And that's for response from the panelists. So we'll have time for longer reflections at the different sessions. So I think without further ado, Achim Steiner, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tom. Honorable Cabinet Secretary, my fellow panel members, and above all, you as participants to this first UNEA Science Policy Forum, a very warm welcome here in Nairobi, the home of the United Nations Environment Programme since 1972. And just as you sit back in your chairs, and perhaps for those of you who are here for the first time, imagine the last 4 decades and how often on this compound here, and even in this hall here, science was the starting point of what we today can refer to many of our international environmental governance instruments and policy responses. So we warmly welcome you here, and I want to thank in particular Jackie also for having made this idea, which just 5 months ago was an idea, become a dream that has come true, to have all of you join us here in Nairobi just a couple of days before the second United Nations Environment Assembly convenes. And it convenes in a fashion that many who in 1972 envisaged this idea of having an environment program of the United Nations in a way that for a long time was not possible, because we had a United Nations Environment Program, we had a governing council, but it took 4 decades before the world said the issue of environment has become so central to the future of what happens to us all, to our economies, to our nations, that in Rio the decision was taken to strengthen and upgrade UNEP, and in particular to realize an ambition that many had tried for years, to create a universal membership assembly. Now, to those of you who work in the world of science, that may seem a small step, but in the world of multilateralism, it is a giant step. There is no other forum today in the United Nations, aside from the General Assembly, in which all nations who are member states of the UN are represented. So as you gather here for this Science Policy Forum, please be conscious of the fact that you are very much part of a vision that is trying to give the environment writ large the voice that it deserves, and that I think governments over the years have recognized will be central to their future decision making. My role this morning is to perhaps set the stage a little bit in terms of where we have come from, where we find ourselves, and where we are heading, and how central science has been, is, and will in an even greater sense be in the future when we think about the challenges that lie before us. The Science Policy Forum comes at a time that I think could not be better. To be an environmental scientist, whether focusing on the atmosphere, the biosphere, or many of the other aspects, whether working in a setting such as CERN in Geneva, or in the International Space Station, or in a laboratory, or in a university, or sometimes as the chief scientist of a government, as Sir Peter does, all of you are the backbone of perhaps the greatest promise that we can make to the next generation, that in the face of so many challenges of environmental change that we confront today, science is actually the community that the world has and is increasingly turning to enable it to understand what is actually going on, the magnitude of what is happening, and above all, how do we use our understanding of this complex web of life on this planet to be able to manage a future in which soon 8, 9, 10 billion people will have to share the resources, the space, the pollution space, the water resources, the land, the food on this planet. To be an environmental policymaker in the year 2016 is also perhaps the most exciting moment in a, well, let's say 4 or 5 decade journey of trying to help the world begin to appreciate that its relationship to this planet, its life forms in every aspect that we can find, is in need of a fundamentally different perspective on the future of development. 2015 was an extraordinary year, and I have been struck by, on the one hand, the skepticism, sometimes cynicism, when, you know, a General Assembly of the United Nations, representing all countries of the world, adopts an Agenda 2030, 17 Sustainable Development Goals, 169 targets, and actually says this is our commitment to a different vision of sustainable development. It is quite remarkable, and I hope during these 2 days here, and for those of you who will stay longer, if you have not yet had the opportunity, is to appreciate quite how profound in its promise Agenda 2030 is for the future. It is, despite Rio 92, despite all the summits and the Brundtland reports and the many, many pieces of work that all of us have assembled over the years, only in 2015 that we achieved truly an integrated approach. Remember in 92 we had the 3 pillars. We had the economic, the social, the environmental pillar. Yes, we said all of them are interdependent, but the way we continue to manage, administer, debate, research in these different domains was more characterized by silos than that deeper understanding of the DNA of sustainable development. That image of the triple helix, to me, is the simplest way of explaining what has changed with Agenda 2030. We now have 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and throughout these goals are woven the elements of societal perspectives, of the economy in its broader sense, and yes, the environment. To some who have worked on these agendas for many years, it is a moment to celebrate. I consider it also the culmination of 4 decades of the promise that those who in 1972 established the United Nations Environment Programme finally reached a point where the world acknowledged that you cannot work with the logic of trade-offs when you're dealing with the fundamentals of life, the planetary boundaries, and the realities that science has allowed us to appreciate. So 2015 is a turning point. It is a promise, it is not a guarantee, as we all know. But just a few weeks later came Paris. And against all skepticism and doubts, the world rose in an unprecedented fashion to the challenge of actually agreeing a global response to global warming, to climate change, and all that is implied within the Paris Agreement. It is quite remarkable that heads of state and government, nations, and then in the signature of the Paris Agreement just a few weeks ago in New York, actually committed to the greatest economic transformation ever to be attempted in the history of humankind. Decarbonizing our economies over the next 50 to 60 years is an untested, unprecedented, and never before tried effort of literally reinventing the way we will produce, consume, transact with one another as a community of 9 billion people by the year 2050. Now, science has been integral to these journeys, and we often forget that it is not just with climate science, with carbon dioxide, the IPCC, which by the way had its beginnings in this very compound also here in its early period, that science began to take center stage. Let us go back to the 60s. Remember people like Rachel Carson. Remember also the discovery of the hole in the ozone layer, a substance that had been invented in the Ford Motor Company in the 1920s to make the cooling agents of car engines work more effectively, suddenly became a substance that found itself in virtually everything we were using in technology, fridges and all sorts of equipment, and in just 50 years had created a hole in the ozone layer. It was scientists who allowed us to recognize that. It was science that underpinned the development of the Vienna Convention and the Montreal Protocol, and it was science combined with technology, public policy, international instruments of cooperation that allowed us just a year and a half ago, for the first time, to actually document empirically that the phasing down and out of ozone-depleting substances had allowed the ozone layer to begin to recover. I often call it the greatest planetary repair job ever attempted by humanity, and it is working. And it was because of science, because of scientists, and you know, sometimes extraordinarily, as you know better than anyone, just one individual who suddenly discovered something, began to work with his or her colleagues, began to create a body of knowledge that in time began to be understood by the public. In inviting you here for this Science Policy Forum, what we are saying to you is the United Nations Environment Assembly is the highest authority within the United Nations on environmental issues. Our role is to build the bridge between where science is emerging and policy becomes actionable. My own determination in my tenure as Executive Director was to work continuously and constantly on shortening the distance between these two universes, and also to shorten the time between where science begins to emerge and societies become able to act. Now, as you will hear, I'm sure, from our other panelists in due course, this is not a simple equation. Science is not perfect knowledge. We have lived through 25 years of the debate about climate change, and it has always struck me how the debate for far too long was conducted in terms of I believe in climate change or I don't believe in climate change. Now, a changing climate is not a debate in religious terms. But it is also challenged by the fact that however much science we can deploy, we will never know everything, certainly not at the beginning of recognizing a problem. So one of the challenges that I hope you can address during these 2 days here is how do we engage with society, whether it is the public, the media, prime ministers, decision makers, when what we know is far from perfect. In fact, we will always ask societies to act on the basis of imperfect knowledge. Science is not just one step and you can turn the key and everything is clear. I think we have some hard lessons to learn about how science has related to this public sense of, first of all, imperfect knowledge or incomplete knowledge. Secondly, that science is not without a political dimension. When you suggest something like decarbonizing our economies, you're touching, literally, on 3/4 of the world's wealth. You are challenging 150 years of established economic structures, corporate interests, capital invested, nations that have built their economies around a fossil fuel-based economy. So how do we deal with the fact that science is not something that simply stands in a vacuum? Science becomes political at the very moment in which it says to somebody, because of what I'm telling you, you will have to change something. A chief scientist on our panel is, I think, both from the New Zealand government's perspective, but also from our community, a great way to engage in this discussion. And Peter, I hope you will provide us with some provocation. The second challenge to the science community is how to deal with the fact that the time it takes to bring science to the point where it can make policy actionable is too long. Now, many of you might say, well, bad luck, the laws of gravity are what they are. I'm not sure that that is the only answer, and certainly what we in UNEP have tried to do over the years, and certainly even more so recently by appointing a chief scientist, is to ask the question of how do we deal with this phenomenon of living in the age of the Anthropocene, where human knowledge, endeavor, exploration, but also just intelligence is beginning to lag behind the pace of change that is happening. I truly believe that we live in an era where our capacity as humans to understand, appreciate, and even conceive of the nature of change has so far outpaced of what we are used to in terms of historical change and evolution and natural changes, that we are a generation that is seriously challenged with rethinking the pace in which we can actually respond. Now, the good thing is that we live in an era where we have more science, more technology, more knowledge, more resources than ever before. And that perhaps is the dual perspective of thinking about our time as the age of the Anthropocene. The nature, the scale, and the pace of change are unprecedented, but so is our capacity, ability, and hopefully also willingness to join forces across national boundaries and across disciplinary boundaries in responding to this. And here is another challenge: interdisciplinarity. Everybody acknowledges it, very few successfully live it or practice it. One of the great things about the IPCC and many of the assessments that the United Nations commissions is that it has, I think, fostered an environment in which interdisciplinary approaches are not only requested, they are fostered and encouraged. But we are still struggling, and the climate change journey has been an extremely interesting one with its different working groups and its different areas of focus, as are our assessments, including the Global Environment Outlook reports, of which we are going to present the first step in terms of the regional assessments at this Science Policy Forum next week in Unea. They are an attempt not only to write up the miserable statistics of our era, because they are very, very troubling, but they are embedding the science of environmental change in a societal and economic context. And that is where I think the magic formula for the science policy interface lies. It is further challenged also by a world with very unequal capacities. For science, for us in the UN and for us in UNEA, the notions of inclusivity, of diversity, and of helping one another across national boundaries in strengthening the capacity of science at the national level, at the community level, and then taking it also onto the global policy level remains an enormous challenge. There are too many people, communities, and nations that remain voiceless in the arena of science that frames the dialogue for policy because they don't have the laboratories, the scientists, the money to travel to the congresses and conferences, or sometimes simply the political support in their countries to be recognized as a vital part of public policy making. So these are just a few challenges, and what I would like to say to you is, as you meet here for these 2 days and then look towards the United Nations Environment Assembly next week, which has at its core the environmental dimension of this new 2030 agenda, and a high-level dialogue focused on this notion of a healthy environment, healthy people, I would urge you to send strong signals from this forum of both what you can bring to the arena of policymakers who are extremely challenged in this day and age. Governments don't have answers anymore, and the private sector on its own also doesn't have all the patents in its drawers to deal with the challenges we are facing. We need to have science engage the public and the policy arena in ways that we probably have not envisaged even 10 years ago. My hope is that in framing a conversation that recognizes that the environmental dimension in the year 2016 is no longer an afterthought, something that you clean up later, but actually will define the foundations for development in the years to come, is at the heart of what we will attempt next week with a record number of participants. You will have, for the first time here, almost 175 nations represented, over 2,500 delegates, 200 actors from the private sector, 300 from the civil society sector. we have a United Nations Environment Assembly, which is the environmental voice in the United Nations and hopefully for the environment in our broader discourse. Let me end by just quoting one very pioneering and visionary leader whose home nation was Kenya. UNEP finds itself in Kenya not only in terms of its own home, but Kenya also gave the world the first Nobel Peace Prize winner from Africa who was an environmentalist and so many things more. Wangari Maathai, who began her journey in a village with women who could not read and write by planting trees to take on the 20th century paradigm of development, ended up being a world figure, but never forgot what her community actually was. In her words, we owe it to ourselves and to the next generation to conserve the environment so that we can bequeath to our children a sustainable world that benefits all. It's as simple and as complex as that, which we are attempting together with you and next week with the world's nations assembling here in Nairobi. Let me also just say to you that some of the reflections that I have shared with you this morning are very much something that will also be part of my future, because I will, in a few weeks' time, step down after my 10 years in this wonderful position of Executive Director. And I will actually join that world from which many of you come now. I will be moving to the University of Oxford and head something called the Oxford Martin School, whose singular purpose is, in fact, to look at how the frontiers of science can begin to change the way that our societies respond to the challenges of the 21st century. And therefore, my hope is that, even if not in the couple of days that we're here together, that with many of you, I will get an opportunity to work in the future also. Finally, let me extend an invitation to you, because the conference rooms are wonderful, but at a certain point they also need to be left. On Sunday evening, we will be organizing or joining a football match, the Solar Soccer match in Mathare, one of the poorest neighborhoods here in Nairobi. And through the sponsorship of Philips and a number of other partners, a football pitch with solar lighting has been established there. I'm not sure how wet or moist the grass will be on the evening, but in order to also take us out of these rooms here and let us join the community of our host city and our host country, I would like to extend an invitation to you for those of you who are here and would like to join us. We will arrange for buses to leave here, I think, somewhere around 5 o'clock in the afternoon. You will get more information. Please join us if you have time. It's a fantastic way to see who we're working for and why we're doing the work we do. Thank you so much.
So as not to create too much of a delay, I'll now take up. Some of you might be wondering why I'm wearing all of this, and I know that a lot of you who know me from the past don't realize I don't normally wear any jewelry, so it's a slight overkill. I was privileged recently to join the Maasai community, and through marriage, so I married the new Maasai chief, and so now I wear the regalia, which has tremendous amounts of history associated with it. My belt is 60 years old, et cetera, et cetera. So I speak to you very much as a new Maasai, but still the chief scientist. It's okay, but it's going to be an interesting moment when we start to talk about indigenous and traditional knowledge, at which point I'll have a bicameral mind, and one side will be doing one thing and the other side will be doing mathematics, so we'll have to see. Anyway, in a very formal way, I would like to greet you, and so forgive me, because Ma is not an easily learnt written language, so I'm still in the oral tradition, and so now I'm going to say something in Ma. Aitumon pukigai, ilakunu tonigo ana ang iti tene Nairobi. And what that means is, welcome to you all, and I hope that you feel that Nairobi is your home with us while you're here. So that's what that means. So. So now I'm going to go back to being the chief scientist or the director of the division of early warning and assessment. And I'm very quickly going to romp through just a few slides so that you know what the kind of boundary conditions are and also some of the more practical points as well. Thanks. So expected outcomes. These are in your little program, so I'm not going to go through them in great detail. But it is really very important that I made one addition, which was put in because I thought, oh my goodness, it's not here. And it's the second bullet point. And I'm doing this very much because within the UNEA resolution of the first UNEA, we were actually expected to take on board the idea of integrating traditional knowledge and indigenous knowledge. And I'm pleased that Anne-Laurie Gaudry is here because that's one of the dynamite sessions that comes out of IPBEST, the platform for biodiversity and ecosystem services. How do you put traditional knowledge together with a more Western construct? So that's the only difference from your program. The next slide is very much where we are today at this moment, which is the session one. You're going to hear from Sir Peter. He's a phenomenon, and I want to say that before he speaks because I was just bowled away, having met many, many chief scientists. But he also is here in his capacity of a new network, which I think is a great addition to the sort of pantheon of how we meet. And this is the network of chief scientific advisors. And if ever there was a need for a comfort blanket when you're in trouble, I suspect this is the network that you might want to call if you are a chief scientific advisor. So very, very much welcome, Peter. I think it's going to be interesting to see how the panel responds to you. You have a good program, so very quickly, I just want to highlight the fact that, yes, you're going to dot yourself between this really quite modestly okay room, architecturally speaking, and another even more enormous room on the other side where you're going to feel dwarfed by the size of it. And if I tell you it's because of practical reasons like laying carpets and everything else, I'm sure you'll bear with me. So cluster near the front, and what we're trying to give you is an enticement through inspirational speakers. We have some fantastic people, so don't feel obliged to stay in the session, but do try and listen and look out for our inspirational speakers. So they're listed here, and they're from all walks of life. They're not just academics, they're not just political scientists, they're not just politicians. They're also people who are doing things on the ground from industry and so forth. So the first day, I think, looks very good, although I still have Ashok missing in action. We'll have to see where we can find him. I don't know where he is. Pierre-Yves Cousteau. Obviously, you recognize the surname, I'm sure. Shikambao, Anne Gary, Antonio, and of course Nick Middleton. So all great names in their own right. Now, day two, similar kind of lineup, vis-a-vis sessions with inspirational speakers. We have invited some children who are connected to GLOBE. GLOBE is a NASA program with teaching attached to it. And we've got this new way of working with the community, bringing new young scientists in from the very beginning. So these children are actually ground truthing NASA satellite data for real. It's not just a little game. And I think it's a tremendous indication of how much trust we can have across all the generations to really do the right and the very best job in science. So going forward then, this is a little bit more logistics. I want to tell you about the digital forum. So behind all of this and the people, very important, there's an enormous kind of digital framework. And it's a platform that we want you to participate in. So the first entry point, if you haven't come in through My UNEA, which is the way that you register and you find all the documents, we've got UNEP Live. UNEP Live is our big knowledge data platform. It carries many, many, many data flows, all the kinds of reports and inputs that we've had. It showcases and will showcase our new geo-regional assessments. Please go visit it. But we also have web intelligence. And we've been tracking UNEA, UNEP and environmental issues over the last few months. Arno will be telling you about it sometime later in the sessions, but it's an incredible tool. I reckon it beats the socks off Google. Sorry, but anyway, I think it does, because it's in parsed language and it's contextual. So I hope you enjoy looking and using it. We're on Twitter. There's the hashtag, SCIPO. We try to do SPF, Science Policy Forum, but then you get all the suntan creams. So we can't do the suntan creams, so we have SciPo16. And then we have a survey, and this survey is running. Please go and have a look at it. We'll make sure that this is circulated. But effectively, it's asking you, as scientists and as policymakers, how do you kind of come at these various problems? And already we can see that the demand side, the policy-making side, is way, way, way more intense than possibly the scientists have really understood. So it's an interesting survey, and we'll present the results at the end of the session. So that's our sort of digital world. We'll circulate that table so you can see all the different hashtags and addresses. We're going to take a summary out of here, which we'll obviously give to Achim to say something in the opening of the UNEA, but also we want to seed into each of the UNEA resolution discussions and the negotiations key findings that you've had the chance to influence. So if you ever felt you could never influence policy, now is your chance. If you can make it into a bullet point, it will certainly enter into the room, and I'm hoping that with many of our negotiators coming, and some of them already here, they'll be able to see just what the scientific community thinks about the issues that are on the table, from marine plastics all the way through. Now, social events, we want time for you to network. You really are very, very welcome here, and we're going to have you here for a long time. So we want to feed you, we want to give you drinks, we want to take care of you. So please come to the sessions. We've got some awards to give to really recognize people who've been working in the field of science policy and women in science and really making contributions. Not always at the top level of the Nobel laureates, but really making a difference. So I hope you'll join us for those awards. And we're going to end up with something called Forum Unplugged, an idea that came out of UNEA 1, where it's an open mic session, have students there and many others, and they, just make your points known if you didn't feel you got them out in the forum. Next slide. Logistics. 2 people, hopefully, are in the room. Bridget, are you here? Bridget's not here. Oh, okay, well, that's a bit of a... Is Harsha here? No, the 2 people who are supposed to be here. Okay, well, anyway, they're obviously doing things. There are 2 people who will solve problems. So we're going to put this on the table there. If you have any problems, there are 2 telephone numbers. More importantly, though, those of you who are sponsored will need your passports and boarding passes and tickets. So the instructions will be on the back table for you to meet them. But there are 2 individuals, and they will make themselves known, and they'll be in the mix all around. And then finally, I want to hand over now to our moderator, who will then introduce the keynote speaker. But thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Achim, Jackie. Fantastic to get started now, get diving into the topic, understanding the challenges and new opportunities of science policy. Sir Peter Gluckman, Chief Scientific Advisor to the Prime Minister of New Zealand, again, and the International Network for Governmental Science Advice. And I think we've got his slides ready. Yes? Peter, the floor is yours.
Oh. Slides up? Yeah. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm going to speak fairly quickly because I think we want time for this panel to engage in the discussion. This is not an easy interface, the interface between science and policy. Scientists often think that just because they think they know something, policymakers must act, and that is certainly not the case, as I'll try to explain. And what I want to do is to really explore the interface between science advice at the international level and science advice at the domestic level. I don't think any of us need to debate the issue, and Achim's already pointed out the criticality of science to where we need to go. And the fact is simple, that to achieve the 2030 agenda needs evidence-informed policy making at both levels. But the issue, in my mind, is what's the relationship between national level science advisory mechanisms and global science advice. And here I'm just going to switch for a few slides and talk about the relationship between science and international affairs, because I think this is at the heart of the issue. If you think about this Often people talk about science and diplomacy, but there's actually two dimensions to this. When countries go and use science diplomatically, they're using it to advance their national interests. They're using it to advance their economic, their trade interests, to deal with resource issues, and in the case of some countries, to project soft power and so forth. But when one goes to talk to scientists about science in the international arena, they're often talking about science to advance global interests. Very different. The best example we have is, of course, the Antarctic Treaty, which was an example of the one part of the world, an ungoverned space, which is effectively governed by science. We're seeing the issues at heart in this and dealing with the SDGs, pandemics, and so forth. And if you think about it, these two perspectives often don't align. National interest, advanced in many cases in ways I'll talk about in a moment, and global interest don't easily fit together. And if you think about how science plays into these two systems, it's quite different. Science plays into the national interests and is dependent on domestic science advisory mechanisms, academies, science advisors, whatever. And then when that science is projected into the international space, it's generally done by diplomats who are not scientists. So you have a particular issue. On the other hand, the people who are advancing science to project global interests is often the scientific community itself, scientific organisations, NGOs, the kinds of people who are often in this room. And often they're not engaged with the domestic decision makers that really matter. Yes, international agencies may have their own science advisory mechanisms, and I think UNEP is a splendid example of one that has developed something fantastic. But at the end of the day, the complexities of the science policy interaction are amplified in the international agenda because most global agencies are ultimately responsive to national governments that then put jurisdictional override over what happens. And we've seen that play out for many years in the climate space. So thus, my point is that thus, while science to advance global interests may be the ambition of many scientists and NGOs, global interests are more likely to be achieved when nations support global or regional goals because of enlightened self-interest. And if you think that through carefully, you see the criticality of strong domestic science advisory mechanisms if we're to see progress on the international agenda. That is the way in which that enlightened self-interest can be achieved. So let me now, for the next 10 minutes or so, quickly focus on the national dimension, because I think, having made the case that to have strong international science advice, we need strong domestic science advice, let me make some quick comments. Firstly, and it's already been said, science is changing dramatically, the policy space is changing dramatically, and the interplay between the two of them is changing dramatically because, in part, the relationship between science and society, and in part, the relationship between science, society and policy is changing. 1942, Robin Merton, that famous sociologist of science, described science as standing apart from society and informing it, like high priests. Can you think of something less appropriate? It highlights how far I hope that science has moved in the last 60 years, but I fear that in many people's minds, both scientists and others, it has not. And science has changed in many ways. We're now dealing with much more complex systems. We're dealing with nonlinear systems. We've gone from the reductionist to the systems-based approach. We talk more in terms of probabilistic terms than uncertainty. And we've moved from what we call normal science to post-normal science. And it's this post-normality which is why the science-policy nexus is so complex. Post-normal science is the application of science where the science is complex, there is much is unknown, and there will always be much which is unknown. The stakes are high and decisions are urgent. And remember, as a general principle, decision makers of today are working off the science of the past. The science of today is informing policy for the future. And there is a high values component about which I will come to in a moment, and the values are in dispute. And if you think about it, this is the science of the environment, it's the science of society, it's social science of human health and so forth. Virtually every issue in science where science impacts on policy has these characteristics. And it's the failure of scientists to recognise this and believe that they can still have technocratic decision-making responsibilities and fail to understand that there are many other dimensions to the policy settings in this area of policy, post-normal science, that can make politicians and the public sceptical about science. And any science advisory mechanism must take into account these characteristics. Science is not values-free. We make decisions all the time which are values-based. But the scientific method is designed to limit the implications of human values on the collection and analysis of data. But how science is used is intimately and inherently values-rich, and therefore policy is inherently values-rich. And we just need to understand how this interplay of scientific values and social values plays out. On the left-hand side of this column, you see the kinds of values that are inherent to the scientific process: skepticism, ethics, avoiding bias in data collection, and being aware that science does not have all the answers is an increasingly important part of that. On the other hand, the very values that society concerns itself with are those which are listed on the right, ranging from worldview, personal values, religious values, cultural values, traditional values, and so forth. There are tensions here. And because of that, values debates are difficult. And science can therefore be an easier way of having a debate when the science is not really in debate than having debates over values. And that's why climate change, GMOs, reproductive technologies, there's been this ongoing battle about the science, as if we didn't understand the science, when the issues of these have been proxy debates for quite different values-based debates. The other point I want to make is that science is really determined by policy is really determined by evidence, but policy can be and should be informed by evidence. There's many other things that go into policy making, and most scientists have a very weak understanding of how complex this is. And they're listed on this slide. They range from public opinion and political ideology through to diplomatic issues. Science and policy making, as I said, are very different cultures, and the relationship between them will vary across different countries and different societies because of the context, culture, and history. And because of that, boundary roles are becoming increasingly important. That is, people who have one foot in the science space, one foot in the policy space, that can act as translators between them. And that's what people like myself, what our role is. This is, if you look up any policy textbook, this is what they'll show you as the policy cycle. The trouble is, it's a total myth. It doesn't look like that at all. That's what the policy cycle really looks like. It's a complete shambles, and precision, and it starts in all sorts of illogical ways, and there's all sorts of strange inputs, and outside, and it's not a pure process, as you can see. So where on earth does science fit into that? That is the challenge, fitting science into that complex process and trying to protect the integrity of what should be said, put into that process through that challenge. And then we have to be clear, why should science have any privilege in that policy process? How does it differ from other epistemologies? How does it respect other epistemologies? It can only do so by sticking to its core values and processes. And that comes to this really interesting issue of the difference between a knowledge broker, that is transferring what we know to the policy process, and being an advocate for a particular position. Now, depending on where one sits within the policy process, whether you're external to it or internal to it, you can take different roles. But ultimately, governments need knowledge brokerage. And it's how that knowledge brokerage is achieved which is critical. So what is the practice of knowledge brokerage? This is what I do. I try to explain what is known, what is not known, what is based on expert consensus, what are the other caveats around the data, and what is the inferential gap between what we know and what we conclude. And there is always an inferential gap in complex science, and we're not very good at admitting it, because it is that gap which creates many of the risks which policymakers have to consider. And we have to consider all the options that the science brings and recognise it's the other policy dimensions that give rise to the choice as to which option is made. The knowledge advocate, as opposed to the brokerage, will be pushing for one particular option. I think we also need to remember that there are distinct accountabilities for those who operate from within government, like government scientists, parliamentary units, science advisors, from those who operate outside government, like the national academies and academic societies. The academic societies and national academies are ideally placed to give what is I call deliberative advice. That is advice on a particular question which we developed over time. The issues come if they don't answer the question that the policymakers ask, and there can often be a mismatch between the two. The problem is it can often only input at one point in the policy process, and that may be too late, and it may get corrupted as the policy process continues. The informal mechanisms of science advice, which are offered by people such as myself within the system, on the other hand, can keep on impacting at every point in the policy cycle, and we can create mechanisms within it which are both accountable and also ensure that the science is not corrupted along the way. So what are the final points I want to make? Hubris by scientists, hubris by policymakers is the biggest challenge to the interface. We inform policy, we do not demand, we do not tell policymakers what to do. There are many challenges around this, but what a good national science advisory system needs is strong external and strong internal mechanisms, and it must be principle-based, and those of you familiar with my work would know that I'm very strong on the issues of the importance of trustworthy, independent processes which focus on science advice. Now, moving it back from the national to the international. I've already said that international science advice needs strong domestic mechanisms, but equally those must be domestically well linked to the diplomatic and related systems, and internationally we need to learn how to talk to each other much better. We already have organisations such as that are bringing science advisory mechanisms together. For instance, the APEC region now has an annual meeting of science advisors and their equivalents. We obviously have external and inter-academy partnerships that bring academies together. And what we now need to do is bring all these mechanisms together much more closely to work together. And so the international network which I represent, the International Network for Government Science Advice, is a network that doesn't care whether you're on the demand side, the supply side, an academic, whether you're a science advisor, an academy head. We try to bring all these people together to discuss matters of common interest. And again, if you look at our website, you'll see that there's lots of opportunities for engagement and taking matters forward. So this is my final slide. Essentially, all the SDGs and the 2030 Agenda require an evidence-based approach to policy making. To do so requires strong global mechanisms, but even more, it involves strong domestic mechanisms to create this sense of enlightened self-interest. These then need to be supported by the appropriate transnational mechanisms, such as international agency advisory boards, liaison between domestic advisory systems, and stronger scientific input into diplomatic mechanisms. Thank you very much.
Peter, thank you very much. I'm tempted to get Peter into a conversation already because the question I want to know is, of those final recommendations, what's not working in your view? But I think we're going to get into that more. Thank you very much for your recommendations already. I think very helpful. We now have an opportunity to hear from a range of voices, and I think, as I mentioned earlier, that gives us a way to hear from different sides, different perspectives, and we'll dive in. The important thing is that each of these folks have been briefed with two important questions. Shall I go ahead and, Zaki, maybe those can get put up. The first one is, who is it that needs to be involved in from the policy and science communities to ensure that decision-making is informed by evidence? So who is at the table? And how do we do that in such a way that it's well-informed? And the second is what actions should UNEP undertake at the Science Policy Interface to effectively deliver on the environmental dimension, looking at the 2030 agenda? So, in fact, what are the actions? What are the steps that need to be taken? And we saw a little bit of that already suggested in what Peter was sharing with us. I will just remind again that we're starting with Her Excellency Judy Wangu. We're in her home territory, so I'm glad that you're sharing your home with us. Cabinet Secretary and Minister for the Environment, thank you so much for having taken time to be here with us today, just to start there. You can stay where you are and speak, or you can, if you feel you need to be at a podium, take the podium. We're looking at 3 to 5 minute contributions, then it's going to be over to you for questions and conversation.
Good morning, everyone. Let me take this opportunity to warmly welcome you to Nairobi. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Akim for his excellent presentation, really on the emergence of environmental and sustainability science, and how this has been an integral part of UNEP, and how 2015 has really been a turning point with both the endorsement of the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. I must say that I'm extremely privileged to have been part of this journey where I spent a great deal of energy and my time advising governments, members of the executive and the legislature and the public sector on using science evidence to inform policy. And of course, when I say science and evidence, I'm referring to the entire STEM field, which is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. But now I find myself with the tables turned. So I'm in this now very precarious position of serving on the executive of the Republic of Kenya, and I'm now required to take action and to bridge the science policy interface, or the two cultures, as it were. And I think Sir Peter in his presentation has made it very, very clear that that interface is not easy. In fact, it is messy. In fact, on a daily basis, I begin to understand just how untidy it is. You see, once scientists agree on a finding or evidence, they then have to engage the policymakers and the policy-making process. The diagram that Sir Peter presented describes it all. This is when we now scientists, and as I'm saying now I'm part of the executive, find out that evidence is actually negotiable. We come with our scientific findings, we say this is what it is, but then in the policy process, this becomes negotiable. Even if it's an area that affects all of us, for example, like what we've started here in Nairobi with the air quality monitoring, that also now becomes negotiable. How is it going to be executed? Scientists, we also find out that when we're engaging in the policy process, timing is everything. For example, do not present evidence or GMOs or stem cell issues just before an election. You will be told, let us get elected first, and then after that, we can discuss this particular issue. Yes, we know you're correct, but the timing is wrong. There is also the notion of hyping or overhyping a particular issue. For those of us that are engaged in energy and in the field of energy, we remember several years ago advising our own governments that never ever will we see oil prices below the $100 per barrel, because we did not anticipate shale oil, and that has changed everything. And we all know what the oil prices are now. So we need also to do a better example in terms of our own analysis to engage and to inspire confidence in the policy-making process. Sir Peter has mentioned hubris, or addiction to knowing that you're right or believing that you're right, is also one area that we need to work on. And now finally, who should we engage at the table in the policy-making process? First of all, we need to improve scientific or science literacy across the board. Science literacy in terms of ourselves in the STEM field, science literacy for policymakers, and then also engaging in a very healthy conversation with the policy process. It is continuous negotiation, and that is really what it means. At the table, of course, we need to have the science academies. We need to have the chief scientists. We also need to engage the politicians. And of course, we're pleased to see that in many countries now, there's actually a science policy office in Parliament that engages and advises the politicians. We also need to engage the civil society organizations to be involved in the policy-making process. So I'll just start with those few remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judy. I think His Excellency, Mr. Conrad Paulson Rivas. Conrad, do you stay where you are? Yeah? Okay. Yeah.
Thank you very much. In a way, I feel most humbled by the wise words have been spoken before me, and this incredible, I think, I would say, big barrel of knowledge that relating to oil that Sir Peter has put before us. But I would like to maybe make another focus, and I would like to start by something quite trivial, which I saw recently on a documentary on television regarding cooking, a chef, and the question of going back to basics and the question of the earth. Our Nobel Prize from Kenya, Wangari Maathai, in a way, everything is related to earth. And I say this because in this documentary, this cook, very, I think, known, I won't say the name, not to overcome his restaurant, of course. He says something quite interesting, which I took note, and I didn't know about. My grandfather used to say, "Thank God for ignorance that you can learn." No. And he quotes somebody there, and he was interviewed later. I've spoken this with our executive director, from a gentleman, Mr. Wes Jackson, from Earth Institute, that maybe all you can know. And he states his idea regarding if you are thinking about an idea that you can solve in a lifetime, then you are thinking too small. And I say this because recently, I was talking to Anne here, recently we had the IPCC meeting here, about climate change. And even if we stopped right now, today, at this time, and I will look at my watch, you know, it will take us 100 years to stop this question of climate change. So, being in front of this scientific community, one feels more inspired, and I want to say something, and going back to the question of food, and with the wise knowledge, I think, of my Latin roots, I think, and my mother having been a philologist, which in humanist terms is the origin of words. You are the origin of the problems. Is the question of restaurant. Again, I go back to the word of restaurant, because restaurant, for people who don't know maybe Latin, is from restaurare, from restore. After the French Revolution, there was nothing to eat, so the people had to go to basics, and all these cooks came to cook for the bourgeoisie, and they had to restore what they had, and this is the origin of a restaurant. We have to restore our planet with your thinking, with your insight, with your scientific knowledge. I think we have to be thought-provoking in the sense that who needs to make this thing? I think we have to look, and I look around here, the question of gender, the question of youth. I think we have to inspire our youth and our gender in the humanity of climate change. I think there's a lot of small entities of thinking people all over the world. You know, and I see Sir Peter here. I was just discussing with some other colleague. I think New Zealand and Chile, we are the two furthest countries away from anybody. We are not in the south of the world. It takes us longest than anybody to arrive here. Even though I live here now, of course. But in a way, I think we have to bring this provocation about thinking. And I was just remembering another thing, going back to the earth, and I'm of the old school, like we were discussing before, you know, where I keep my paper clippings, and I was seeing here, it says here, about climate change. The earth is greener now than 33 years ago, thanks to CO2. Because the amount of CO2 that we have in the atmosphere, I understand, I'm not a scientist, of course, is now being more used than before. So I think we have to go back to thinking. I think that the immediacy of social media, the immediacy of communications, of internet, and all these things, we have a lot of information, but nobody's thinking too much. And then I had another thing here, which I was reading, preparing for this, which I wanted to focus, is the question of nobody likes the philosophers anymore. Nobody wants to think anymore. Everybody wants to have everything solved. And I think that the question of reason, the question of Cartesian Aristotelic thinking that the scientific community brings to us is most inspiring. I think this forum here is a great provocation, and I think we have an incredible amount of clever people. I think we have to be careful. Now, making a joke about scientists is here, not to slip here, because all the neuronas are here in the room, of course, with all the clever people around. Anyway, no, I say this in a way to excite ourselves, to bring, I think, this scientific thinking to the public opinion, Because in the end, as Sir Peter was saying regarding policy and diplomacy, what is not posted, and I say now in internet terms perhaps, what is not posted or what is not known does not exist. And I think this is a question when UNEP and this panel, when we can bring things about to be thought-provoking to the public opinion and to young people, I think we are making a good job. And last but not least, and I want to say this because this is a policy issue of my country, is in the question of gender. And two things I'm surrounded here by two bright, wonderful women, and I want to say this, which I was amazingly surprised. One of the United Nations says, if women nowadays were brought into the working field in an equal basis as men, I think the planet would be 2.6 trillion US dollars more so in feeding into this whole planet. And to conclude, I want to say another phrase that's always in my knowledge when we are at United Nations, you know, and scientific community I think is also there. It is everything, there's the question of financing. In the end, my grandfather used to say, you know, everything that costs money in this world is cheap. You lose an eye, an arm, a son, there's no money for that. So I think we must insist on this, and I'm so happy and humbled to speak to you. Thank you very much.
And Larry Godry, please.
Good morning, colleagues. Thank you, Jackie, and colleagues for the opportunity to speak this morning. I'd like to first start by bringing warm greetings from Bob Watson, who is the new chair of IPBES and also a past champion of the earth of UNEP, and he cannot come today for sad family circumstances, but his heart is with all of us today. I'd like to offer comments on challenges and new opportunity in terms of strengthening the science policy interface from the perspective of IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and I'm the Executive Secretary of that platform, as we call it. IPBES is in its third year of implementation, so we are still relatively new, and we are, of course, learning from many existing initiatives, in particular IPCC, which comes a lot in our discussions. We learn a lot from IPCC, but of course we adapt what IPCC has done. We also adapt it to the conditions of biodiversity and ecosystem services. Our bread and butter is very much producing assessments, and we produce assessments on particular themes. For example, we just released a thematic report on the state of pollinators, pollination and the impact on food production. We also make assessments of particular methods. We also released our second report just recently on what tools we have in terms of scenarios and models to make future predictions of changes in biodiversity and ecosystem services depending on various socioeconomic choices. And we are also currently performing 4 regional assessments in Asia Pacific, Europe and Central Asia, the Americas and Africa. We are also 10 years after the release of the global assessment, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, we are going to start this month actually a global assessment on biodiversity and ecosystem services. So we try, as I said earlier, to really learn from existing mechanisms, and I would like to share with you 3 thoughts on what I see as some key conditions for success in terms of science being used by decision makers. And the first one is to be policy relevant and that seems obvious when you say it, but you cannot just decrete that. You need to design methods and concrete activities that ensure that you are actually policy relevant. And let me just give you a couple of examples on how we do this in IPBES. We have a mechanism, for example, that seeks input and requests from policymakers so that they all come up with the questions that they have in terms of biodiversity and ecosystem services management. We bring all of this together and we assemble a work program so that the entire work program is a response to these questions from policymakers. Another way that we do this, of course, is to include in each one of our reports section on policy options. So, for example, in our regional assessments, we have chapters on policy options and policy management in order to be policy relevant also at the regional level. So that's my first point. The second point, in terms of criteria for success, in terms of science policy, is to be legitimate and credible. And again, we hear that a lot. It's one thing to say it, but another one to actually be like this. And we are not saying, we're not claiming to be there yet, but we have learned from others and we have started to put in place some mechanisms with a hope to achieve this noble goal. And one of them is to be as inclusive as possible. We are trying to be inclusive in terms of geographical balance. And again, that's something that is difficult to achieve. So keeping in mind excellence in science, of course, we do achieve geographical balance in all of the expert groups that we assemble. We know that it's one thing to have an excellent scientific report, but we also know that there are many such reports that have remained in shelves because they were seen as being produced by scientists from the north and not by an inclusive set of scientists around the world. So what we say is important, but who says it also is really key, and we really try to make this concrete and to enforce this. And along these same lines, we also try to be inclusive in terms of the knowledge that we bring on board. And Jackie mentioned indigenous and local knowledge. That's a challenge that we've given to ourselves. And we are indeed piloting some mechanisms to learn how to bring in indigenous and local knowledge to the table of the assessments together with what we call Western science. So that is my second point, be legitimate and credible. And my third and last point, there are many points, but just for starting the discussion, is that the science policy interface is made of various components, and it's easy often to have these components go with their logic in their separate ways, and they really need to be tightly connected in order to really have a good channel and circulation between science and policy. And these four components are the policy itself, the assessment, the science, and the observations. And in order to have good policy, it needs to be informed by assessments. Think about the IPCC assessments. They themselves don't produce science, so they rely on good science. So science is there, and they also rely on observations, long-term collection of data. So all of these components need to go hand in hand and cannot go their separate ways. So we all together need to build a collective effort. We need to contribute to a common enterprise. And in biodiversity, we are still in the business of strengthening each one of these components and also making them speak to each other. So one example of this is with IPBES and the pollination assessment, for example. We are building a close connection with the Convention on Biological Diversity. There is now a recommendation going to COP13, which would ask parties to report as of now on a regular basis on the state of their pollinators, the impact on food production. The convention would be compiling this, and slowly we would have some image on how our scientific report is used or not, how useful it is, and what we can learn for the next set of reports. So that's how you build tight connections between science and policy, for example. We're also going to have regular annual dialogues between IPBES, the scientific community, thinking in particular about Future Earth, also agencies funding agencies that fund research, so that gaps highlighted in policy and in assessments are shared with the scientific community, so that then we can catalyze the generation of this missing knowledge and data, so that in future assessments we benefit from a stronger body of knowledge. So that is for my third point, which is to strengthen the 4 components of the science policy interface. And I end with a couple of challenges, as we were asked to do. And of course, there are many. We are starting, we encounter many challenges. One of them, of course, will be how to assess how useful these assessments are. So that's something that we're starting to think about in terms of how to follow that, to monitor our impact. Another challenge is to use all forms of knowledge. I've flagged that before. The availability of data, of course, we are depending on that, and there are gaps in data. For example, for the pollination, it was abundantly clear that there are more data, as we know, for status and trends in Europe, in North America, quite a bit in Latin America, and still very little here in Africa. And I end with the engagement of social scientists. That is really a key point, one that I know other similar platforms are struggling with as well. And we really are making an appeal currently in all of our groups that we're assembling for our future reports for a stronger response of social scientists. That's a collective challenge, I think, that we have here, because at the end of the day, natural scientists are not going to speak directly to the trees or to fish, that's obvious. We need to think about changing social perceptions, changing in our institutions, changing many, and that's the business of social scientists, and we therefore need to think creatively about how social scientists can better see what UNEP does, generally speaking, as their own. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne. Maybe speaking directly to the trees might not be a bad idea sometimes. Let's hear from Ashok Khosla. Welcome.
I come here because I see so many friends in this room, and the monitor was getting in the way, so just want to be able to address you all in more directly, eye to eye. So much has been covered in the last half hour with issues about policy and science and the nexus and the interplay between them. In general terms, I would have basically said that if the preceding discussion hadn't taken place. However, I think it would be more productive if I focus on one aspect of science and policy, and that is natural resources, biotic, abiotic. Natural resources are the forgotten sibling of climate change and biodiversity loss. And very recently, in the last 10 years, UNEP started an operation called the International Resource Panel, which is a sister of IPBES and IPCC, as an ongoing platform for exchanging knowledge and information between scientists and policymakers. But before I do that, I'd like to share with you some personal notes. The knowledge, the ideas that I have about resources comes from two major life experiences, professional experiences in my life, both of which were conceived right here in Gigiri. 35 years ago, together with the then executive director, the late Dr. Tolba, I conceived of what became the first social enterprise called Development Alternatives, and it was with the promotion of UNEP, with a very generous grant, that I was able to start that operation, which for the last 35 years has been single-mindedly looking at the interactions between people, particularly women, and natural resources. So what I have to share with you comes from 3.5 decades of hard work in the field and with governments and with the international organizations on these issues. And for the last 10 years, I've been co-chair of the International Resource Panel, which has enriched those feelings. So what I'm about to share with you is essentially a product of hands-on work over a very long period of time. As Sir Peter said, the nexus between science and policy is very complex. It's exceedingly urgent, but it's so complex that one might think of it as a kind of an interplay, a kind of an interaction, hopefully mutually reinforcing interaction between scientists and policymakers and others to look at how the world over the next few decades can be reoriented to become substantially more sustainable than it is today. We have these three platforms. Let's just look at IPCC, which is the oldest one, and IRP, which is one of the newer ones, and look at what are their advantages and what are their ability to contribute to the change that's needed. At the very macro level, which would be global and maybe even national and regional, IPCC had the privilege of dealing with climate issues over 3 decades and accumulated a vast array of army, if you like, of scientists and doers who were able basically to bring to today a state of knowledge which one would describe as very good at the macro level. We know what the processes are, we know, in spite of a few deniers, what the possibilities are at the policy level, at the global level, at the national level. And at the micro level, where the rubber hits the road, where the real action has to occur, the citizens, the scientists, the academics, the businesses, they need to deal with these issues in a much more concrete way, developing new technologies, developing new institutional frameworks, developing new local policies, and so on. Their climate has, partly because of the length of time it's been around, been brought to a stage where I would describe it as good. We have good knowledge which can be applied to the issues of reducing carbon emissions. Resources have really come on the radar screen only over the past decade. Has been fortunate to have an extraordinary group of people working as the International Resource Panel, and together with many other very important initiatives around the world, has been able to accumulate what I would classify as good knowledge for policy and action at the macro level. But at the micro level, what do we do every day? How do we essentially deal with these issues? We've actually made progress only on the front of what we might call efficiency, recycling, remanufacturing, reusing. These are the kinds of things that we normally trip off the tongue when we talk about how to deal with the conservation of resources. Now that's very important, and it involves all the engineers and the economists, and the market, in fact, in a sense, takes care of a large part of it. Look at the spread of solar energy. Prices dwindling, and more and more of it's being used. And no doubt in a couple of decades, the world will be a solar energy-driven world. But by and large, the sustainable consumption and production issues that go beyond simply efficiency remain rather lagging. Recently, the IRP delivered a report to the G7, and it has a terrific coverage of efficiency issues. But you know, the resource issues are much, much, much bigger than that. Efficiency, in my view, is probably 25% of the kinds of issues that we need to deal with. there are human issues, there are social issues, there are environmental issues, all of which need science of a kind that we don't normally think of as science. Again, the two worlds. Science, it's not just physics and chemistry and biology and mathematics. Science is also anthropology and social science and various kinds of economics and many other things. And that science has to be also evidence-based. That science also has to be made more and more quantitative and persuasive, because with it really is the other 75% of the issues that have to be dealt with. So I feel that today the resource panel is at a point of inflection where we now have to think beyond efficiency. We have to figure out how those people living in tribal areas and forests are going to make a living that will make a difference. And you know why it's important? This is not a moral question. This is not an ethical question alone. Of course it is. But it's an ecological survival issue. It's those people who are poor and deprived of the resources who are actually destroying what were called renewable resources. The rich, the affluent, destroy the non-renewable resources, the poor destroy the renewable resources, and what do you have left? Equity, inequity, disparity in this world is probably the greatest threat to all the issues that we're talking about. All the science and policy issues we're talking about here at GIGIRI this week are ultimately the result of huge and unacceptable inequities. Unacceptable not only because they're morally bad, but because they threaten the survival of not only civilization, but life on Earth. So we have very big jobs to do here, and I certainly am one who doesn't want to overstate the case. But let's face it, if we're going to leave behind a world for our children, or at least their grandchildren, who are going to have lives at least as good as ours, then all the people on this planet must have those lives, which means we've got to bring down the ceilings. It's not very often accepted. We have to raise the floors, and we have to plug the leaks. We've done a lot on plugging the leaks. Not enough maybe, but a lot more. We've done a fair amount, a little bit about raising the floors, but we do very little about lowering the ceilings. You know, the Mahatma was right. He said there is enough in this world for everyone's need, but there isn't enough for even one person's greed. So our science policy nexus has to be one, as several speakers have said, that persuades the governments, who will be persuaded by their publics, who will be persuaded by their media and academics, who will be hopefully persuaded by scientists, that we no longer can go business as usual. Today the time has come when natural resources are a more immediate threat to survival of civilization than possibly climate change. I said more immediate, I didn't say a bigger, but a more immediate threat. Biodiversity loss and the loss of natural resources. Now, don't get me wrong. Mother Earth has huge amounts of resources. That's not the issue. But the issue is, can they be got hold of? And can they be accessed by those who don't have them today? Thank you.
Andy Rifkin.
Well, I've been taking notes furiously. That's what I do. This is my 32nd year as a science and environment journalist. I also have multiple hats. I was on the initial engagement committee of Future Earth. I think it's an important entity. It's very amorphous still, but the idea of finding ways to get science oriented toward helping society solve problems is a very vital part of what has to happen in the next decade or two. I'm also on the Anthropocene Working Group, which you may have heard about because of something I wrote in 1992 in a book on global warming. I essentially predicted that scientists of the future, as I wrote in 1992, would define a geological age of our own making, a post-Holocene geological age of our own making. So I'm the only kind of non-scientist on that group, and they'll be making these pronouncements soon to the broader science community about whether there's actual evidence in the rock that we are now a geological force. So that's just to give you a sense of me. So my reactions here are that this is a very rich array of observations on where we're at. I can't begin to tell you how resonant they are with other things I've learned in the last 3 decades. Sir Peter and Achim both nailed that science is a vital component of decision making, but don't count on science to make the decision making easier. There's so many ways that is true that I'll just name one, maybe one or two. More science often makes things more complicated. The more you dig in. In 1988, when I began writing about climate change, it was all very simple. Give you one example. Hurricanes would be fueled by warmer oceans and become more powerful. The latest science in the IPCC says looks like there'll be fewer hurricanes in a warming world because the atmosphere and ocean systems are complicated. The ones that form have a higher chance of getting into a stronger category. If you're the mayor of a coastal city, does that tell you something new than what we knew in 1988? No, it says it's more complicated. So don't count on the IPCC in yet another iteration to make it all easy for the diplomats or for mayors. That's one thing that's important. Another is, one thing I've learned is there's path dependency. This is a phrase I didn't even know before 5 years ago. Organizations, institutions, governments, journalistic enterprises like the New York Times become path dependent. In other words, your structures, the way you examine problems is a function of some historical reality that doesn't apply now. The interdisciplinary need in the sciences, economics, philosophy related to limiting regrets heading toward trying to achieve these SDGs they don't fit our old patterns. In academia, I've been in academia now for 6 years at Pace University, and at the New York Times, and at Pace University, and at the UN, and in most government the agencies still don't talk to each other in a way that allows for a smart, resilient approach to coastal protection, to conservation, balancing water needs with energy needs. Finding ways to break those barriers is essential, which is why that chart that Sir Peter showed of that ugly interface, you could look at that and go, oh my God, or you can look at that and say the more the better, meaning the more we're examining the walls that were created in a 20th century norm that don't fit so easily in the 21st century, the better off we'll be. And that's why I think this week is really valuable. A couple more things. And you've heard this already. We have global goals. Now that Earth system science has identified lots of things that are planetary boundaries, that whole body of knowledge. But it's always local realities that shape what happens or does not happen. And you all know the factors that temper those decisions. As Judy was saying, it's about the politics of the moment or just some particular externality or some other conflicting agenda. And that's why if global goals aren't somehow filtering down through to the local level, not just the national level, then that leads to some tough things. I'm writing a piece right now that I'm hoping to post later today on the vaquita, that little porpoise in Mexico's Baja California. That's gone from 500 individuals left in the world to 60, and it's Chinese appetites for a certain fish that are driving that. It's also an illicit trade, an endangered fish, and often transferred through the United States through someone putting them in the trunk of a car and driving to San Diego. That species is going to be history. I had to write, in 2007, I wrote essentially the obituary for a species. I never had to do that as a journalist until 2007. I've written obituaries for people, but not for species. And that was the Yangtze River dolphin, the Baiji. I anticipate in 10 years, if I'm still doing what I'm doing, I'll have to write the obituary for that porpoise. But when you look carefully at why it's not being conserved, it's all about local issues, where even the money is going to help fishermen move away from the destructive practices and that thing. So that's, that is probably one of the biggest challenges in this room, for some of these SDGs particularly. Who is not in the room? Maybe they are in the room. I think is academia. So much of the science that is done in academia. And the way you get ahead in academia is producing new knowledge, not necessarily useful knowledge. And I love my friends who work on particle physics and the like, but if we don't re-examine in academia the norms of how you advance, the norms of what you get encouraged, incented to focus on, then the SDGs are likely to be lagging in the next couple of decades. And 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago, there was a really vital paper. You can Google for this. It's very easy. Dan Kamen, who's a marvelous scholar and analyst and practitioner looking at energy futures, both in like rural Africa and the next technology. In 1997, he co-wrote a paper called promoting the idea of mundane science. So just Google for mundane science and you'll find it. It's on the merits of mundane science. This is actual science that can help society do things, accomplish these goals. But that's not what you get rewarded for in academia right now, which is a really important thing to think about. Finally, what's not in agreements? What's not in the Paris Agreement? And I've been writing about the climate treaty process since before there was a treaty process. And Paris was great because it got everyone in the room and everyone pledged, but it was leaving out the big stuff has to happen for emissions later in this century. Going to zero when the world is going to 9 or 10 billion people all wanting decent lives is an epic challenge. And you can have these sparse debates about 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, but when I look at trajectories as a journalist, I say there's what I wrote about at the time, and you can find this easily, is the reality gap behind the emissions gap. That just because countries pledge to certain things, there was no pledging. One of the things that's not in the Paris Agreement is building the capacities that we would need to do the deeper accomplishments later in the century on emissions. So how do you do that? More science. There have been a couple of papers recently promoting the idea of having the commitments, the INDCs, incorporate what countries are planning to do in R&D that can facilitate the deep decarbonization and the resilience building. And of course, then there's also capacity building in science in developing countries. What are the obligations to do more of that from the rich countries? Very important questions. Education, just a couple more things. Judy, it was great to see her focus on education, literacy. And it's not just what we teach. It's not, kids don't need to know what a watt is. They need to know how energy works. And there's an example in New York City. Any urban school can do this, where the kids go to the boiler room for the day. And the custodian who runs the building is the teacher for the day. And he teaches them that your school is not just classrooms, it's a system. It's a system like the global system. This is how much oil we use. This is how we maintain the temperature, and the students get engaged with the idea, well, how can we do that better? So just think of that simple template, just a boiler room tour. Maybe not so much in a country that's tropical, but there you have an air conditioning. You have your heating, your HVAC system as well. So it's how you teach, not just what you teach. And there's so many other issues related to education that are involved, that are important. One thing I got to mention is there are these unanticipated aspects of education fostering us the capacity to accomplish these goals. In this town, in Nairobi, there's a guy named Alex Azet, who's the CEO of the African Population and Health Research Center. I met him about 5 years ago at a meeting on population in the U.S. And he told me his personal story. He was from a rural village. Several of his siblings died of the usual early mortality issues here. His father somehow got him on a bus to go live with an uncle in the city, and he got enough education to move on this trajectory that took him from being likely, a statistic in a early rural mortality death to being a leader of Africa's intellectual capacity to deal with fertility, family planning, all that health outcomes for women. So that tells me, every time I see a story like that, it shows me that there's this unbelievable potential, human capital creation potential in just facilitating education. And it's true for, it's just important for all of these things. Communication, innovation, the more focus there is on how to communicate, to share and shape ideas, the better there will all be. The only thing changing more rapidly than the global environment is the global communication environment. 7 billion cell phone subscriptions. In India, there's a wonderful template for maximizing knowledge sharing. There's an NGO called Digital Green, and they created a YouTube system where farmers in all the local languages in India can post a video explaining a better planting practice, greatly amplifying the impact of an extension service. Can you imagine being in charge of the agricultural extension service in a country with 100 million farming families? How do you get a good idea around? Use social media. And so remember, think that's not like putting out a press release. That's not like writing a better summary of this meeting. That's where the communication innovation actually is advancing human prospects directly through sharing and shaping ideas. There's many examples like that. And then finally, and that's what's, I think, partially in this room is, the SDGs are all mainly framed around numbers. But the more, after 30 years of writing about issues like climate change and biodiversity loss, I've tended to shift my own focus. My own goals are to maximize traits. What are the traits? When you have a wicked, like that nest of interrelated issues that Sir Peter pointed to, when you don't really know how you're going to get there, the one thing you do know is what are the traits and capacities in individuals or in your societies, wherever you come from, that give you better odds of heading in the right direction, heading in a direction that can decarbonize, that can provide access to energy, that can reduce poverty, and you know what those traits are. You know what they are. I've come up with my own shorthand. So finding a way to start measuring capacities more than thinking about numbers. Like I said, 2 degrees, 1.5, in 2100, what happens won't be a function of those negotiations over those numbers. It'll happen over capacity building. And I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I think you mentioned social media, and this is a moment for curiosity, to bring your curiosity out. And someone who actually knew my number already sent me a question. Is there someone here from Future Earth? There was someone, Bo? Yeah, just one of my colleagues said you probably have some questions or a reflection based on what you've heard.
Oh, thank you very much. While listening to all the presentation, we just realized that what Future Earth is currently doing is exactly responding to the science policy interface, to the nexus, to addressing the sustainability issues. Just a bit of history. Future Earth is born through a long process. The process started in the 80s, where the World Research Program on Climate was established with the influence on IPCC. And later we created IGBP, and later we created Diversitas, and is here. And lately we created International Human Dimension to continuously supplement the type of knowledge which we need for policymakers. But yet again, the issue of integration was a big issue. So the Earth System Partnership was created in 2001 actually to address this integration. But that was still not enough. UNEP was not quite satisfied on the way science is packaged and mainstreamed to policymakers. And Futures was born in 2013 with the premises of co-design and co-implementation of research. The way we work is to try to make the best representation of our activities in regions, have a global distribution of our secretariat, be represented in all regions to be inclusive. The domestic knowledge should be taken from the bottom up to the synthesis level to be used for the policymakers. We use all the core projects in different levels of science, but it's not enough. We had to create joint point and interfaces between those core projects. And that's when we create those clusters. And now the new flagship of Future Earth is what we call the Knowledge Action Network, to create transdisciplinary interfaces, joint point between the communities to work together and create the responses to the sustainability issues you just all mentioned here. So Futures needs all your support, and a few folks from Futures are here during the whole session to interact with you on the program.
And a question from you for the panel?
The question is, how would you support Futures? We are looking for funding to do the research.
Let us serving one. Others, who has worked with Future Earth from the panel? I think, yeah. Anne, any reflections on?
I don't have a check to sign. Yeah, indeed, I've been involved in as Diversitas, which has then morphed into Future Earth. And just one point that I think is important, perhaps as a response, is that Future Earth, at least in my view of the science policy interface, is not its own the entire science policy interface, as I think you hinted. It occupies quite an important position and space there as the scientific community interested in providing scientific knowledge to assessments and to policy making. And therefore it engages with colleagues from IPCC, with colleagues from the conventions and all of that. And so we rely, us, IP-based, others, rely on the Future Earth community to generate the knowledge that will then be used in the future assessments in order to inform policy making. None of the policy-making mechanisms, none of the assessments, as you know, generate their own knowledge. Right. So that's why you need that connection that I was referring to.
And Peter, you had a reflection.
I had the opportunity last year as chair of the International Network of Government Science Advice to run a workshop for Future Earth for young scientists on explaining to them how policy works. And I think that the point I would only going to use this to make is that I think, just as the last speaker made the point, that science needs to become more useful to society, and that is changing the way in which the scientific agenda, although some academics find that difficult to understand. I think what is taught to the scientists of the future is also critical. They do not understand these issues of values in the same way. They do not think in terms of the fact that science itself has values which must be protected, but there are distinct framing of values to what community needs. They do not fully understand, no matter how idealistic they are, how complex this interaction is, and that and again it's been made, just getting up there and saying the facts say this, therefore countries must do that, often actually, as we've seen in climate change, leads to more strongly divergent and embedded views rather than constructive views to find a solution. So I firmly believe, and I was pleased that Future Earth asked us to do so, that all scientific training, whatever, needs to now include what I'm calling the civics of science, which is understanding how science really does relate to society and to policy.
Thank you, Peter. Questions from you all, your curiosity now. Just raise your hand, say your name, and ask your question.
Thank you, Tom. Li Shaoyi, I'm working for UNEP. I'm the head of the Secretariat of the International Resources Panel. Question again to Peter and also to others. Science is very sophisticated. Policymakers are impatient. Now we are in the age of information booming. Everybody wants a pager, few lines, 120 words. How we narrow this gap? That is a communication issue. Thanks.
Well, I think that's a really important question. And if you, and one of the slides I rushed over in a hurry, I had a triangle: science, society, and policy, because it is that interplay of those three that matters. And I think one of the problems we've had is that in general, academic reports, when they come from particularly national academies or IAPs, are very lengthy, very dense, not designed for the audience they need to reach. I think academies in general tend, because of their membership, to want to show off how academic they are, to want to protect the integrity of their academy. And so I think there is a real need for the academies, whether they are working through unions or whether they're working at a national level, to write in a simpler way. If you think about it, the data that scientists need for academic work is enormous. The data that policymakers need for making their policy is much more redacted, and the data that policymakers need to give to the politician is much more redacted than that. What my Prime Minister needs to know from me is merely what is the trajectory of climate change and why it matters that he makes decisions. He doesn't need to have all the detail that under that. The Ministry of the Environment needs a bit more detail, and they need to be confident on the science behind that. The problem that I've got is most of the science we're now dealing with is post-normal in nature, which makes it very nuanced, and the social media does not deal with nuance well, and it allows for minority views such as the climate denial movement or the to have really strong impact. And I don't think we've solved this problem of effectively the loss of the fourth estate as a place of true information transfer, and now it's all about sensationalism and Murdoch ruling the world. I didn't say that, please. The issues of how we get a vibrant, nuanced conversation which all the publics of the world are entitled to be part of and must be part of is a real problem.
Yes, just to keep that conversation going for a minute, we have someone from the Academy here. Can I ask you just to give your reflections on what you've just heard?
Hi, my name's Tracy Elliott. I'm representing the Inter-Academy Partnership, which represents about 130, just over 130 science, engineering and medicine academies. And we've produced statements and reports on a wide range of environmental issues and conducted the IPCC review back in 2010. I actually had a couple of questions.
A little bit louder would be helpful.
Can you hear me? Right.
Yeah.
We've heard about the importance of national science systems, and we know that national academies play an important role in those. And I wondered, to what extent does the lack of compatibility and coherence in and across the national research systems and in and across national science advisory systems inhibits the implementation of global policy frameworks? So presumably we shouldn't adopt all the same system. One size doesn't fit all necessarily, but is there anything we should be doing to encourage more consistency and quality assurance in these issues?
Is this, Judy, something for you that in terms of national science policy? We're back to Peter, I think, but others. How do we get to this place of consistency across the different people advising?
Your point is well made, and I had to hurry, and I think it was again picked up, that you need a complete system. Now, it will have different elements and different weightings, but you need internal advisory mechanisms, such as those provided by science advisors, who can reach directly to the President or Prime Minister or to ministers and maintain integrity of the knowledge through the process. You need academies or equivalents or expert panels that can advise. They need to be able to talk to each other without one controlling the other, and they need to be to able to talk across the regions and globe to each other, which is why INGSA was created. There is a brilliant review early this year in Trends in Ecology and Evolution by Neil Stensis and Hutchings on the various components and why you need all these components within a system, whatever they're called, and how they get integrated. I can give you the reference later.
Akim, yeah.
Just a part, because in listening to the earlier presentations, there is continuously an inherent tension, whether it is at the global level or policy to science. who actually frames the question or who sets the agenda? I mean, we have this fascinating oscillation between science actually telling politics, Houston, we have a problem, but then it is politics that actually tells the scientists of how they would like that problem to be examined. And I think what you're alluding to with the national academies is an uncomfortable arena in which that idealized image of the independent scientist meets the arena of the compromised politician. And I think we do need to give some thought to this, because at the end of the day it is actually a circular process. Science throws something into the arena, politics begins to pick it up, but then it has to turn back to science to be advised and informed. And what happens at the level of National Academy of Sciences, I think, is very much something that perhaps in these international, IPBS, IRP, IPCC, and many other assessments, has begun to play itself out. We even have this debate in the Global Environment Outlook process. Governments want to have the final say of what goes into the policymaker's summary. How compatible is that with listening to scientists without telling them what you want to hear? So somewhere, this is not an impossible issue, but it's a tension that I think, addressed more explicitly, as you just said, Sir Peter, there needs to be an active, transparent conversation, because then you don't run into a wall. You can actually navigate that terrain. And a very important point in my mind.
So it's not only who's at the table, but the way you negotiate at that table and engage one another. We've got a couple more questions here.
Yeah, very quickly, I think one of the issues is science tends to get into this axis too late. Policy making is already happening in informal brainstorming between ministers or ministers and officials very early on. And that's why and the academies often only come to understand what's going on quite late in the piece, almost at the implementation phase. Again, it's a reason why you need something within the internal system that can get it to the scientific community to understand where the issues are going to emerge. Right. It's right at that beginning.
Yeah, so recognizing we're all in the test tube at this point. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. I'm called Evelyn Nambiru Maura. I'm from the African Academy of Sciences, but I was also part of the team that wrote the GEO6, which will be presented tomorrow. My question is addressed to Her Excellency Judy Wakungu. You said that evidence is negotiable. To scientists, this is a little alarming, because you would want it to actually address the issues as they should be. So what can we do to try and make it less negotiable in your arena?
Thank you. I'm a scientist myself, so when I became a member of the executive, that is what was alarming to me in terms of the science policy interface. Because to make that political decision, you will have to negotiate. And that's why science literacy is extremely important, and that's why the negotiation is ongoing. That's really what I mean, that if you go with evidence to the political arena, a negotiation must take place, and it takes time. And it's both ways, and science literacy, therefore, and education is what's important, because politically, political decisions have to be convenient. Yeah.
Right, and negotiated, yes, yes. We have one more very short question.
Thank you very much. Hello to everybody. I am a politician. So, I am the chair of Foreign Affairs Committee in the Romanian Parliament. But I had the chance to serve like minister in 2 different ministries, regional development, environment, and I had the chance to catch a little bit the international overview, served like the former chair of CSD 19, the last CSD, and of course in the Governance Council vice chair. So I have the picture, and also my academics from regional development and SDGs. So I have a suggestion. We have to deliver very clear messages to the politicians. And we are working on the level of IPU to have a handbook for politicians, to say to them what you have to do to implement those databases and all these issues which are, you know, very sophisticated. So we have to work together, maybe, UNEA, UNEC, regional bodies, IPU, to have a handbook for politicians and to indicate them which are the main issues which will be implemented in the political life. And I would like to congratulate my colleague from Kenya. We will establish also in the Romanian Parliament a scientific advisory body in this year to have near us this advisory body and to tell us what is wrong, what is good in the life of a politician, a daily life. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm afraid that we have come to the end of the session, and I have to be the brutal person to cut us off because we have many, many things. I know people have to leave. So I'd like, first of all, to thank all our panelists and, of course, our moderator, please. And I would like to then just first of all identify Bridget, who's now here, who's going to stand up. So if you are sponsored, please see Bridget with your tickets, your boarding passes, your passports, and she'll make sure that you get reimbursement. I think it's been a fantastic start. I just cannot express my gratitude enough to say that having brought Peter and all the others to the table, I think they tackled the topic in such different ways that just underlines the everyday decision-making that every one of them is having to make. And I'm always curious, who's the scientist they reach for? What's the book they reach for? Who do they get in the room? Who do they trust? And I think maybe at the end of these 2 days, we might have a clearer idea of who's at the end of the hand when they actually reach out for that knowledge, if you're a decision maker. And is the scientific community ready and willing to grab the hand to be taken in to the policy-making machinery? Because it is a machinery. Anyway, with that, there's coffee outside. We're now going to break into 2 groupings. You'll see in your program CR1, CR2. This is CR1, that is CR2. Please enjoy yourselves, and we'll see each other through the day. I think many of our panelists are here. Unfortunately, our minister has to leave, and I think Achim will be in and out. But please take the opportunity to continue to engage, and we'll see you again and again through the day, and hopefully by tonight at a very special ceremony. So thank you once again, and have a great day.
I'd rather have your message.